Hello, welcome everyone. In this video, we will look at the first part of the essay, Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences by Jacques Derrida. Derrida does not clearly divide the essay into sections, but I am calling this first part Rethinking the Structurality of Structure. So, in this video, we will look at this initial section of Derrida's paper, which is about rethinking the structurality of structure. We will explain what that is in the course of this video. Again, I am not going into great detail. I'm not analyzing the essay in great detail in this video. Rather, I am trying to give a summary of the main points of this essay. So in this particular video, we will look at just the first part, and then in subsequent videos, we will look at different sections of the essay. So, rethinking the structurality of structure. What is this structurality of structure? First of all, Structure, Sign and Play. This article is basically a paper that was presented by Derrida on 21st October 1966 at a conference that was held at Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore in USA. The conference was titled The Language of Criticism and the Sciences of Man. And it was a conference that was intended to popularize structuralism in the human sciences, in the humanities and the social sciences. Later, this same paper was published as Chapter 10 of the book Writing and Difference, which was published in 1967. Writing and Difference is a collection of articles by Derrida, and it was in that book that this essay was first published in French. Derrida's paper functions as a critique of structuralism, even though it was presented at a conference on structuralism. His paper functions as a critique of structuralism, and it is widely acknowledged by many as the starting point of the movement which we today call post-structuralism. So it was a conference about structuralism. Derrida presents this paper, which is ostensibly about structuralism, but which is actually a critique of structuralism. And by this presentation of this paper, because of the problems that he points out in this paper and the solutions that he suggests, the directions that he indicates, we can say that this paper is one of the first works of post-structural theory. So Derrida begins his paper by mentioning an event. This is the word that he uses, an event that has occurred in the history of the concept of structure. So what is a structure? How do we conceive of a structure? What is this concept of a structure? And this concept itself has a certain history, and some event has occurred in the history of the concept of structure. And this event serves as both a rupture and a redoubling. These are the words again that Derrida uses. An event has occurred in the history of the concept of structure, and this event has served as both a rupture and a redoubling. A rupture means a break. So some event has happened in how we think about the concept of structure, which is a rupture, which is a break with how we have previously thought about this concept of structure. So now we have to think about it differently. In that sense, it is a rupture, but it is also a redoubling in the sense that there is a continuity with how we have so far thought about structure. Traditionally, the notion of a structure is that of a grouping of elements ordered and grounded by a center that controls the rules of free play between the elements. So as we mentioned in a previous video about post-structuralism, the notion of a structure is that a structure is composed of several elements. It is a grouping of several elements, but all these elements are ordered and grounded by a center, a central element. The central element controls the rules of free play between the elements. If all the elements are always in free play means they can do whatever they like, there are no rules governing them, then the structure will not hold. Then there will be complete anarchy. So a center or a central element is that which prevents that kind of an anarchy. The center is that which holds all the elements together, and the center both controls or limits the free play of the elements but also makes the free play possible, which means it is a rule set by the center which decide what the elements can do, in which direction can they move, what can they do, how can they interact with other elements, etc. For example, if we take a social structure like the state, then we have a central element which is traditionally, maybe it is the king or the queen, the monarch. Nowadays we have the government. So the government sets the laws, or the king sets the laws which determine how the other people in society should interact with each other. What are the ways of interaction which are legal, and what are the ways of interaction which are illegal? So this is just a very simple example of how a structure works in a very social situation. But this is exactly how structures work in at the conceptual level as well, in philosophy as well. So if there is a philosophical system, then it is like a structure with many elements. The different concepts and terms and ideas of that philosophical system are the elements of that structure. The different philosophers who talk about those concepts are also part of the elements of that structure. And however, there will be a central element that determines the relations between all the other elements. Which of the elements have to be foregrounded, which of them have to be privileged, and which of them have to be marginalized. All these are decided by the center. This is the traditional idea of a structure, which is a group of elements with the center that controls these elements. But there is a problem in this imagination of structure. And this is the problem that has existed even before structuralism comes into being. From time immemorial, according to Derrida, Western philosophy has had this concept of structure, even though we have not always called it by that name: structure, element, center. Those are not the names that we have been using. But from the time of the ancient Greeks, from the time of Plato onwards, for example, we have had the same structurality in Western philosophy. So, as I already mentioned, the center was imagined as a fixed point that grounds the structure, as the raison d'etre of the structure. Raison d'etre means it is the reason for the existence of the structure. And the center is also imagined as a transcendental signified. We have already mentioned this term in the previous videos on post-structuralism and deconstruction. A transcendental signified refers to a signified that exists independent of all signifiers. So the idea is that this signified, transcendental signified, exists somewhere out there in the world. And it doesn't matter what signifiers we use. But ultimately, even before the existence of those signifiers, this transcendental signified existed. Examples are God, king, man, truth, etc. For example, we have the word God. So in different civilizations across human history, we have referred to God in different ways. We have different names for God. We have different characteristics that we associate with God. Our imagination of God has changed over the time, from the time of the ancient Greeks to the time of the Old Testament to the time of the New Testament, etc., etc. Our imagination of God has changed. So the signifiers that we use to refer to God have undergone several changes across the history of humankind. But the traditional idea is that God, the actual God, is a transcendental signified who pre-exists all these signifiers. So it doesn't matter whether you call God Jehovah or Allah or Zeus or Vishnu or whatever. Basically, God pre-exists all these signifiers, and the signifiers are they come into existence only later. So God is not dependent on those signifiers. Now, this comes to be later questioned when we say that actually, when Nietzsche says God is dead, And when we say that God is actually a concept that has been created by human beings. So there we are displacing God from the center and we are putting man at the center. Like that. And nowadays we say that man is no longer at the center. Instead, we have a post-human concept of the world, right? So like that, the idea of who is actually at the center of the universe can keep changing. But there is always some element that we consider to be a central element. And that central element, in our imagination, that central element is a transcendental signified. However, there is a problem with this concept of the center. What is the position of that center within the structure? The center, according to Derrida, exists simultaneously outside and within the structure. It is within the structure because it is part of the structure. It controls the elements of the structure. So it can't be really outside, it has to be part of the structure. But it itself is not controlled by any other element of the structure. The rules that make the elements dependent on the center do not apply to the center. If the same rules apply to the center as to the other elements, then the center would not be the center anymore. The center has to be exceptional. The same rules that apply to the common people do not apply to the king. Right. So just like that, the same rules that apply to all the other elements do not apply to the center. Therefore, the center is not controlled by the structure, and then this what does control the center? Something has to control the center, right? So maybe the center has its center outside the structure. Maybe the center is controlled by something outside the structure. But if that is so, then this center, the center that we see in the structure, let us call it center A. Center A is not the real center of the structure. Center A is controlled by a point called B, which is outside the structure. If that is so, then B is the real center of the structure. But B is also not the real center, because if B controls center A and all the other elements, then who controls B? Ultimately, B cannot be controlled by A or any other element. B has to be controlled by something else outside the structure. Let us call it center C. Like that, it is an infinite series of substitutions of center for center. Again, if you think about the previous video in which I mentioned the Wikipedia format, you will get a better idea about this. If you try to find the meaning of a word in a dictionary, what the dictionary will give you is not the meaning in a very deep philosophical sense, but rather a set of words which together form the meaning. Then, if you go and find if you try to find the meaning of each of those words, that will take you to further and further words. So ultimately, you never reach the actual signified. Just like that, in a Wikipedia format, if you go to one page, there will be many hyperlinks that take you to several other pages, and that will take you to even further pages. So this is how the structure actually works. The structure is not a totality that can be easily fixed. It is controlled by a center, but that center is not a fixed element, but rather that center always leads to a center outside that structure, which in turn leads to another center, like that. And thus the shape of that structure, the form of that structure, the structure of that structure always keeps expanding. This is a problem faced by structuralism. So, according to Derrida, the center is ultimately a space where a series of substitutions of one center for another occurs. The center is not a fixed locus but a function. The center performs a function. What is a center? There is no answer to that. Where is the center? Again, there is no answer to that. But what does the center do? What function does it perform? The function of linking together all the elements, limiting as well as permitting their free play. Western philosophy has always attempted to determine these changing centers in terms of presence or fullness or positivity. We have already studied this concept called metaphysics of presence. So this is the idea that, the presence of something. You always look at things in terms of a positive or an idea of whether something is full or not. Is this thing present? Is truth present? Is goodness present? That is how we always look at different concepts in Western philosophy. And many examples that Derrida gives are Plato's theory of ideas, Aristotle's concept of telos, Descartes' ego, etc., etc. There are many such concepts, but basically all he means by mentioning these concepts is that from ancient times onwards, Western philosophy has always tried to determine these changing centers in terms of the metaphysics of presence. Now, structuralism begins to rethink the structurality of structure itself. Until structuralism, the idea of a structure with elements and centers has always existed, but we have not thought about it, especially in terms of its structurality. What is the structurality of each of these structures? What is the structurality of a family? What is the structurality of a kingdom? What is the structurality of an educational institution? What is the structurality of a particular philosophical school of thought? These are questions that begin to be raised by the structuralists. So, structuralists begin to rethink the structurality of structure itself, which is a way of thinking that is analogous to the structure. To rethink the structurality of structure means you have to think in the same way as the structure. You have to retrace the structure, the contours of the structure. And because of that, we can call it a redoubling. We are creating. So, for example, we have the structure of a family. And then when we describe the structure of that family, we are repeating the structure. We are redoubling it. Okay? We have the structure of a philosophical system. And when we describe it, what structuralism ultimately does is describe all these structures. So when we describe it, we are copying the structure. Right? You cannot describe something without copying its structure, without repeating its structure. So structuralism starts to repeat its structure, but at the same time it is questioning the structurality of structure. And this is what Derrida calls that event which is both a rupture and a redoubling. And Derrida says structuralism or structuralists are not necessarily the first people who have questioned Western philosophy as it exists. He mentions a few people, a few thinkers who have contributed to this kind of a critique. The first one is Nietzsche. He mentions Nietzsche's critique of metaphysics, of concepts like truth, goodness, etc. Nietzsche has pointed out that there is no, first of all, you remember Nietzsche is most famous for that statement, God is dead. So he critiques the idea of a God who exists, who pre-exists the universe, who has created the universe, who controls us all, etc. So that itself was a main important moment when Western philosophy had to undergo a huge change. But Nietzsche also critiques the concepts like truth and goodness by saying that these are not concepts that we should take for granted. There is no truth that is a priori there. There is no truth that is already there. There are certain conditions in which we create truth. In certain conditions, we say, okay, this is the truth. So society constitutes the idea of truth and goodness, virtue, etc. The second thinker is Freud, who has critiqued self-presence, consciousness, self-identity, etc. So before Freud, the idea was that we have something called self-identity or self-presence. Our self is a our self has a certain wholeness. Our self is not fragmented. It is whole. It is something that exists without needing to be questioned. But Freud is the person who says that no, what we think is one whole, that is our self, is actually composed of these different contradictory elements called the id, ego, superego. And he starts to really question what are the things that form our identity. So the psychosexual development of the individual is formed by many other influences, and it is not like we come as selves or as souls. So traditional metaphysics or traditional philosophy considers that all of us have souls that are created by God, but rather Freud says we don't have souls in that way. Rather, we have a sense of self, which itself is fragmented, which itself is developed through our experiences in this world. And the third person is the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who has critiqued the idea of being as presence. What does it mean to be, to exist in this world? Is it our presence in the world? He has critiqued that as well. So Nietzsche, Freud, and Heidegger, Friedrich Nietzsche, Sigmund Freud, and Martin Heidegger are a few thinkers that Derrida mentions who have questioned the structurality of structure even before structuralism as a mode of thought, as a critical framework emerged. Now, the problem that structuralists face is that structuralism advocates decentering. Decentering means to remove the center or to question the center. But ultimately, structuralism is dependent on the language and concepts of Western philosophy, which are logocentric. Logocentrism is also a concept that we have mentioned in the previous video. Logocentrism means the centrality that we afford to logos, and logos can mean speech, logos can mean thought, it can mean reason, etc. So Western philosophy is ultimately logocentric, and however, if we are to critique Western philosophy, we don't have any other tools except the very language and concepts of Western philosophy. So the concepts that we use exist within certain structures of thought. Derrida calls this a syntax and a system. Any concept that we use to critique the structurality of structure, to critique Western philosophy, exists within the syntax, within the grammatical structure of Western philosophy itself. So here when he says grammar, he is not talking about language, he is talking about the grammar of that system, the structure, the rules that constitute that system, which is Western philosophy. Therefore, how do we deploy, how do we use the same concepts to destroy the same structures that give rise to those concepts? This is the dilemma faced by the structuralists. Now, Derrida mentions somebody who tried to, he gives the example of a thinker who tried to work with this, who tried to come up with a solution to this dilemma that was faced by the structuralists. He mentions the work of the structuralist anthropologist Claude Levy Straws. He was a cultural anthropologist, Claude Levy Straws. In his book titled The Raw and the Cooked, Levy Straws mentions how he tries to bypass the binary between the sensible and the intelligible by placing himself at the level of science. So Levy Straws found out that when he is working as an anthropologist, he has to deal with the binary between the sensible and the intelligible. Sensible means that which we can sense. Those are material things which we can sense using our five senses. Things we can see, touch, hear, taste, etc. And the intelligible means that which we can think about. Intelligible means concepts. So the sensible refers to material things, those things which can be sensed by our sense organs. Intelligible refers to concepts which can be thought by our mind, by our brain. So there is a binary between the material and the conceptual, between the sensible and the intelligible. And Levy Strauss finds this binary problematic, and he tries to bypass that. He says, I try to bypass it by placing myself at the level of science. However, Derrida says that is not a proper solution, because a sign itself is a relation between a signifier and a signified. What is a signifier? Saussure calls a signifier a sound image. If it is a sound image, then it is sensible. It is actually material. There is a sound and image which constitute the signifier, right? It is something that is written and you see it, or it is something that is spoken and you hear it. It is material. And the signified is a concept. It is intelligible. It is a notion, a concept, an idea. So by placing yourself or by analyzing things at the level of science, you are not actually bypassing the binary between the sensible and the intelligible as Levy Straws thought he was, but rather the sign itself is a relation between the sensible and the intelligible. Now, Derrida says there are two ways of reducing the difference between the sensible and the intelligible, or rather between signifier and signified. Basically, this is the problem. There is the idea that there is a signifier and a signified, and however, you want to reduce this binary, or rather, you want to destroy this binary by reducing the difference between these two. Two ways. First one is to submit the sign to thought by saying that, actually the sign is the signified. The signifier is just something that came later. The signified pre-exists the signifier. This is what we have been saying throughout Western philosophy, throughout the history of Western philosophy, by saying, for example, that God pre-existed the creation of this universe, and therefore every word, every signifier that we use for God comes later. The signified God is a transcendental signified that pre-exists any signifiers whatsoever. That is what we have been saying so far. But now structuralists are questioning it, Derrida is questioning it, and he's saying, now what is the second way of reducing the difference between signifier and signified? The second way is by questioning the very system of thought based on the relationship between the sensible and the intelligible. So, all of Western metaphysics, all of Western philosophy, including structuralism, is based on the relationship between the sensible and the intelligible, between the material and the spiritual, between the signifier and the signified, right? So you have to question this entire system of thought. But there is no way to question that system of thought without using concepts from the very same system. This is a problem that is faced by the structuralists, and this is a problem that Derrida points out. And by pointing this out, by focusing on this problem, what he's saying is that even as he is describing structuralism, he is saying that structuralism is inadequate to solve this dilemma. So, how do we solve this problem? We want to critique Western philosophy, but the very concepts that we use to critique Western philosophy are taken from the same body of knowledge called Western philosophy. So, these concepts have the same problems as the body of thought that we are critiquing. Then, how do we do that? Is there any possibility of going outside philosophy and critiquing philosophy? That is the question that Derrida asks. And how does he try to answer this question? We will look at that in the next video, in the next section, where he talks mainly about the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss at different points of his academic development, and using those ideas, Derrida does not give us a full solution, but rather he tries to give us certain indications on how to take this question forward and how to find possible solutions for this.